Dr. Adam Ritchie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very glad that you accepted this invitation. You are in Oxford right now. What time is it there?
Getting close to dinner time, so it's about a bit after 5 p.m.
Cool. It is 12 here, noon. Dr. Adam Ritchie, he used to be a lecturer of mine at the Blavatsky School of Government, Oxford University, and he was also a supervisor for myself on different areas, especially science. And I always thought it was very surprising how the university prepared us for things that were coming later. Even we talked about epidemics and pandemics in a class with you, and it's very interesting. And now to see you working on the Oxford vaccine and try to save the world, I think that's great. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm well. We we all just try and do our part to make the world a slightly better place than where we found it. I hope that's what we all do. It just happens, as someone who works with vaccines, that what I'm doing is very, very important just at the moment. I mean, I like to think what I do most of the time is quite important, trying to develop vaccines against rabies and other diseases. But this COVID-19 situation has focused our minds, and obviously Oxford has worked really hard to get a vaccine out as quick as we can.
Perfect. I like that. So this exercise we're doing is I called out on my followers and on people in Panama to send us questions, frequently asked questions about the vaccines, and many of them had the same questions. And one very repetitive one was, how come you got to this Oxford vaccine so fast compared to other diseases, like HIV and other diseases that people have been waiting for that solution to come? Can you please talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's probably a few things there. You mentioned HIV. I used to work on HIV. There are some diseases and some infections which are very difficult to vaccinate against, of which HIV is one. The flu's pretty tricky. Malaria is really hard. But these are the exception, not the rule. When you think about it, there are lots of diseases we've been able to vaccinate against, like smallpox and polio and measles and mumps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the reasons things have worked quite well is I think COVID-19 is quite straightforward, or the virus that causes COVID-19 is quite straightforward to vaccinate against, we hope. And that's why the vaccines that have been through clinical trials all appear to work pretty well. We're all very happy with how they're working, both the one we've worked on and the ones that other groups have developed, which is great. So that's the first thing. It's about biology. The virus is something we can vaccinate against fairly easily. The other thing that's been quite important for us is background knowledge. So we have a platform, this thing called ChAdOx, which is a viral vector that we use as the basis of our vaccines. We use it for our rabies vaccine. We use it for our Zika vaccine. We use it for all sorts of diseases, malaria, all sorts of vaccines we've developed on this platform. And what it means is we've used it in thousands and thousands of people, and it's something we can alter very quickly against a new disease. So in this case, my colleagues, Teresa Lamb and Sarah Gilbert and a few others at the university, as soon as we knew the information about the COVID-19 virus, this SARS-2 virus, they were able to update the vaccine platform so that we were able to add the COVID part to it. So that part was very straightforward and very easy for us. But the thing that's different, really different this time, is going from that moment to giving it to people. Normally that takes a very long time, but not because the science moves slowly, but just because money moves slowly more than anything else. So normally, we would do some experiments in the lab, maybe vaccinate some mice and see how it works. And then a year later, we might get some money to manufacture a small scale amount of it for a phase 1 clinical trial. And then that will take a year or two. And then we apply for more money. And so it's actually the big gaps between parts of the process which slow things down, because normally it's not an emergency in the same way. Normally it's not a case of we need it as quickly as we can. So in this one case, we were able to do things like, my team focused on manufacturing. So we started manufacturing this vaccine back in April, before there were clinical trials, before we knew it would work. That would never happen normally, because that costs millions and millions of pounds to do that. And if the vaccine didn't work, it's money that had been wasted. You normally don't do that, but we're doing that. the safety checks, the trials, they're pretty much the same as normal, just everything is happening fast in between the steps.
One good question that I have is,
Mm.
how do you all the competition vaccines also, how do you all arrive to the vaccine almost like at a similar time or something? Did you know you were gonna have the solution for it, or you're gonna find out the vaccine for that? Like, did you know it would take 6, 7, 8 months?
Well, we didn't know it would take that long. There are some things that are always going to take some time. So for instance, before a vaccine goes into the first ever human, it has to go through, and here in the UK, it has to go through an animal study, and that study has to be completed. And you can't, these are the things you can't take shortcuts on. So that study has to happen, and it takes a few weeks for it to happen. The thing that's different is normally after the study happens, then the people who are doing the study spend a couple of months analyzing the results because they're doing lots of studies at once and your study is not the priority. But this time it was, they did the animal work and then analyzed all the results as quickly as they could. That's the sort of thing that's sped up. So yeah, so there are some things we can estimate like that. We know roughly how long it takes to manufacture. So the fastest we thought, so back in February, March, the fastest we thought we could have possibly had a vaccine that would be available for what we call emergency use, so approved by the regulator, would be September, October this year. Last year now, 2020. So having it approved in December 2020 was pretty close to that, only a couple of months slower. You know, our September, October time was if everything had gone perfectly all the way through, which never happens, of course.
Got you. Many people have asked me about the vaccine effects, Oxford vaccine effects, short-term, long-term immunity, how long will it last? If this vaccine is just to have an immunity, and once you have COVID, you have like lesser symptoms or something like that, or is it to prevent yourself? How will develop itself?
So almost lots of little questions there. So let's work backwards, and if I miss any of them, you can ask them again. So the vaccine, you know, vaccines do multiple things sometimes. Some vaccines only do one or the other. But it looks like the Oxford vaccine, and I'm hopeful the other vaccines as well, and it looks like this so far, will be effective in terms of protecting you from getting infected, but also if you do get infected, preventing the severity of disease. So one of the strongest findings from our recently published clinical trial with the Oxford vaccine was that no one who got the Oxford vaccine ended up in hospital with COVID, right? So less people got COVID, but none of them ended up in hospital. Where in the control group, those who didn't get our vaccine, double figures ended up in hospital, and a few of them very, very sick in hospital. So the control group didn't get our vaccine, that happened, but in our group, no one ended up in hospital who had our vaccine. So that's very promising that even if you get COVID, it's going to be less severe. So but also less people get COVID with the vaccine as well.
You can still get COVID, and that it doesn't mean you'll like stop wearing masks and face shields, right?
No, not straight away. It's the environment around things like lockdowns and masks and you know, social distancing and all these sorts of things, and vaccines. All these things contribute to slowing down the spread, right? All those things interrupt transmission. So the idea that, you know, this question, when can we stop wearing a mask, or when can I, you know, I want to know, when can I fly to Sydney and hug my mother again, who I've not seen now for a couple of years? You know, that's dependent on multiple factors. The vaccine is likely to have the biggest effect. If we get a vaccine to everyone in the world and most people take it, then there won't be enough people for the virus to infect anymore, and it should go away. But as we get to that point, masks will continue to be helpful. I expect at least for months to come, maybe through most of 2021. You know, I expect by 2022, we won't see it so much. But it may, you know, I don't know, I can't see the future, but it may just become culturally a bit more common in a lot of countries. So in parts of East Asia, because they had SARS and they had bird flu and swine flu outbreaks in the last decade or two, mask wearing is much more common there just generally, like when going to the shops or the cinema and stuff like that, than it is in most countries. So that may just become more common.
Perfect. How about the immunity? How long does it last? And can you speak a little bit on the doses? I know the Oxford vaccine is 2 doses compared to other vaccines who are
so most vaccines work in the same way, in that a first dose sort of will stimulate your immune system to fight the virus off. The second dose, which we call a booster, does that again, but does it stronger. So 2 doses tend to be better than just 1 dose. For lots of vaccines. Now, for some vaccines, 1 dose is so good that you never need the second dose. It's not needed. But for some vaccines, you need 2, 3, or 4 doses for long-term immunity, because it keeps stimulating the immune system. For all the vaccines that have been licensed anywhere in the world so far, it looks like multiple doses are required for strong immunity, but even a single dose offers some pretty good immunity. The data on it is not as thorough as for 2 doses, because in most of the clinical trials, people are getting 2 doses. But we can see once people have had that first dose, a week or 2 later, they start to be less likely to get infected. So it looks like 1 dose does offer some protection as well. 1 dose is better than none, but 2 is better than 1. We don't know that 3 or 4 are going to do anything further, but for all the vaccines, 2 doses is pretty protective. And we're, Pfizer, Moderna, the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, as well as Sputnik and a couple of other vaccines coming from other parts of the world, all seem to be offering good protection from the data I've seen with 2 doses, very good protection. And, if you had said to me back in March, we were going to have protection over 60% from multiple vaccines, I would have gone, that's fantastic. So I think we're in a good spot on the vaccines.
Speaking of protection, will it protect us from the new variant or multiple variants that might come? Do you think we'll have like mutations on this and will remain endemic, just like influenza or something?
Mutations and strains always happen. It's pretty unavoidable. The question is what's the risk of one that makes a difference? So we've seen something called the UK strain and something else called the South African strain, both of which appear to spread more easily. That's not a huge surprise. It's quite common when a virus enters a new species. This is a virus that has spread to us from animals. It's quite common for it to sort of adapt to the host so it transmits well. One of the good things is that there's no benefit to the virus of making us ill. There's a benefit to the virus of spreading well. A virus that spreads well makes more viruses that spreads well. But a virus that makes us sick it gets no benefit. It doesn't get a commission for putting someone in hospital. It doesn't help the virus. So the risk of ones that make us more sick is less so. Now, the vaccine, once we start using the vaccines on a large scale, we will start to see whether there is a risk of this, what we call it escape scientifically. So if something escapes from the vaccine. I think it's unlikely, but it's certainly a possibility. It's certainly something that the whole epidemiological and scientific community is going to be watching very, very closely, because there is a lot of virus going around and there's lots of opportunities for a mutant to arise that can escape from a vaccine. But I hope not. COVID and the coronaviruses are not very highly mutating vaccines. The reason we don't have a vaccine against HIV is it mutates so fast. It just mutates so fast. No vaccine can be effective against it using any technology we currently have. Malaria tends to be a bit similar. It tends to evolve away from the vaccine, so vaccines stop working. But most things don't. Smallpox never did. Measles doesn't. Mumps doesn't. Rubella doesn't. Most things don't. And, we've never seen anything in coronaviruses that say to me, this is likely to be like HIV or the flu even. The flu mutates a lot. Coronaviruses mutate less than the flu. So hopefully not, but you've got a plan for it. So what happens if it does? Pfizer, Oxford, Moderna, you think it was fast now. Next time, the next vaccines, if we had to make one in 2021 against a variant, it would be even quicker.
Does it work with the new variant? With the current one?
It does, from what we've seen so far. So the South African variant has been tested, I think, against the Pfizer vaccine, just in lab experiments. So we haven't had time yet to check it in people, but in lab experiments, it still neutralizes it. So it still induces antibodies that stop it from infecting cells. And that's the core of how vaccines work. We're doing the same experiments with the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, and we would expect the same answer. Although the Pfizer, Moderna, and Oxford vaccines are all different, they all target the same thing, which is that spike protein that people might have heard about. The spike protein lets the virus get into our cells, and if you can block that protein from doing its job, you stop it getting into our cells. And that's the whole point.
How about the recipients of the vaccine? Can anyone have the vaccine? Can anyone be a recipient? How about like adults, like people above 60 years old, pregnant women, people with disabilities? How about that?
So you know, things have moved fast, which means the clinical trials haven't covered everything yet. So normally with a vaccine, you know, you do healthy adults first, and then you start looking at other groups, and that's sort of where we are. Because the elderly have such a high death rate from COVID-19, they've been a big focus early on, as well as healthcare workers, because healthcare workers are at the front line and they get exposed a lot. So in a lot of the trials, both ours and from other groups, we're focused on getting into the elderly quickly, the over 55s, the over 70s, as quick as we can, and also healthcare workers. And it's been really good because the vaccines appear to work very well in the elderly, which is great news, because as you get older, you know, my knees, as I get older, work a little bit less well than they used to. I don't kick the football as well as I once did. But your immune system starts to wane as well once you get sort of over 50, 60. So we're really pleased with how well the vaccines have worked in the elderly. What we don't have much data on yet is children, because children are not a priority group at the moment. They're you know, they obviously can spread COVID, they can get COVID, but they very rarely get very sick from it, sort of thing. So they've not been a priority group. So those trials haven't been completed yet. So I don't think we're going to see a rush to vaccinate children. We're going to see a rush to vaccinate the elderly. Here in the UK, and this is decided by regulators, and I'm sure Panama will have their own health regulators and the like to decide this. But breastfeeding and pregnant women can take these vaccines, sort of thing. That's fine. In terms of people who maybe can't, beyond that, you would have the normal, you know, people who are immunocompromised, where the vaccine's not going to work. People who have certain conditions might have some side effects. But for most of these sorts of vaccines, we don't say if you have any allergies or if you have asthma, for instance, you can't have the vaccine. You know, I'll have the vaccine one day. I'm allergic to certain grasses and plants, but that's not going to stop me having the vaccine. My wife's asthmatic. She will have the vaccine one day. It's not going to stop her. The thing that might stop someone is if you have an allergy to some antibiotics, which are sometimes used in manufacturing the vaccines. But the good news is that if you're allergic to one type of antibiotic, but not another, that may just change which vaccine you can take. So there are some antibiotics that are maybe used in the Pfizer vaccine. So maybe you wouldn't take the Pfizer vaccine, but you take our one instead, or vice versa. You know, there are things used in our vaccine which someone might be allergic to, so you'd take a different vaccine. But that's quite common. We have the same thing with the rabies vaccine, where there are 3 or 4 different rabies vaccines. Some people can't take some of them because of potential allergic reactions.
That's interesting, very interesting. And how about like people who have a flu or a cold? You know, if they're sick, can they take the vaccine?
Yeah, I know that's funny. People tend not to take vaccines when they've got a cold or a flu because you're not feeling very well. I imagine if someone's got a cold or a flu at the moment, going to a vaccination center to get a vaccine is probably a bad idea, just in case you have COVID. Because, of course, at the moment, anyone who has any COVID symptoms, please don't go somewhere where there's other people so that you might infect them. A vaccine doesn't work straight away. It takes probably 2 weeks for it to really kick in. So someone with COVID going and joining a line to get vaccinated might spread it to other people in the line before their vaccine starts working.
So that's the question I have now. So if you have the vaccine today, you can get contagious tomorrow, right? Infected tomorrow.
Absolutely, and that's something to always pay attention to. So you know, getting a vaccine in the arm. I mean, you know, I'm not a top even though I was involved in creating the vaccine and getting it manufactured. I'm not a top priority, so I'm not going to get it next week or anything. But I can't wait. but it is quite a moment getting a vaccine, especially in this situation where there's a pandemic. So you might feel like when you get the jab in the arm, you can go out and do something. Here in the UK, there were people getting vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine in the lead up to Christmas. But of course, that didn't mean they were protected at Christmas, as it were, sort of thing. It takes a couple of weeks to really kick in. And we've just got to be careful of that. We've got to be careful not to get so excited by the fact we've had a shot of a vaccine to think we can now just go do whatever we like, because that will be counterproductive. We've just got to be careful of that.
What's the percentage of protection with the Oxford vaccine? Are we speaking about 60%, 70%?
Yeah, that's tricky to answer, because of course perhaps the best way to describe it is our clinical trials were academic led rather than company led, the ones that have been reported so far, which means we asked some slightly different questions, and it was a little bit more complicated. So, overall the efficacy looks like it's about 70% for stopping people getting infected, but it's very high for stopping people getting sick, needing hospitalization. As I said, no one who got the vaccine needed hospitalization. But there have been different dosing approaches used, and there's some suggestion that using different dosing approaches might make a difference, and there's some suggestion that having the doses a little bit more separated might be helpful. And but that's not clear. This is the sort of thing where as people get vaccinated on a population level, the UK is now vaccinated over 1 million people using the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, with no problems or anything like that reported so far, sort of thing. So but what we don't know is, is it going to be 90% overall? Is it going to be 80% overall? The important thing is it's going to be reasonably high. The World Health Organization set a threshold of wanting it to be 50% effective. And all the vaccines that have come through so far are at least 50% effective, but much more generally.
One question that was quite asked is about people with diabetes, people with hypertension. They're very common diseases here in Panama.
Yeah.
Will it be effective for them, or?
Yeah, for people in those categories, that should be fine. And in fact, they're important categories, because if you have hypertension, you're at higher risk of COVID severe disease. So it's quite important. The clinical trials so far have focused on the elderly rather than those with comorbidities like hypertension. But there's no reason to think they won't be safe, and they should be fine. As I said, I'll get the vaccine. Might be revealing a little bit too personally, but I'm a larger gentleman myself, and I have hypertension. No qualms having the vaccine or anything like that. That should be perfectly fine.
So Adam, if I take the vaccine today, will I have to take it in a year's time, the year after, or what's the expectation for it?
Yeah, so we don't have a full answer to that yet. There are some vaccines you take you might take annually at the moment, the obvious one being the flu. But the reason you take that every year is because the flu mutates very fast. And so you get new strains all the time. And the immunity you had a couple of years ago doesn't really protect you anymore. That's why we give the flu shot over and over again, because it's a slightly different shot each time. That's as opposed to some other things like that you get boosters for, like tetanus, for example. So you might get a tetanus, a vaccination against tetanus, and every 10 years you might get a booster. That's because the immunity against tetanus slowly disappears from your body. So it stops being as effective. And one of the things we don't really know is how long the immunity against the coronavirus will last. Natural acquired immunity against other coronaviruses does not last very long compared to most infections. So there are some concerns that this immunity won't last as long, and that I doubt you'd have to have it every year, but it may be a bit like tetanus, where maybe you'll have a booster in 5 or 10 years' time, just to make sure your levels of antibodies and other parts of your immune system are as high as they can be to protect you against it. But that is the sort of thing that we won't know for a few years. We'll only know that once we've had the vaccine in the population for a while, when we'll need those boosters.
Lots of people are wondering how much, what's the average cost of a vaccine, compared to other vaccines. I know the Oxford vaccine is like cheaper compared to all the other vaccines. So 2 questions. Why is it cheaper, and what's the average cost?
So why is it cheaper? One of the reasons is my colleagues and I didn't sleep for about 3 months. The team I work with, where I've mentioned rabies a couple of times, that's because we're interested in rabies. And so over the last few years, we've been trying to develop a method, not just for having a rabies vaccine built on this platform, but for recognizing that vaccines against rabies are an economic issue, not just a scientific issue, in that how much they cost is what's the problem for rabies. Rabies vaccines are tens of US dollars each, which means they're too expensive to give to the whole world. You can't, it's not like the measles vaccine, which is pennies or $1 a dose. This is much too expensive to give to billions of people. So we've been trying to develop manufacturing processes for making the vaccine really cheaply, really efficiently, so that you make a lot of doses, a lot of high quality, safe doses, as easily as possible. And so we were working on that over the last few years. When COVID came along, of course, that became even more important very quickly, because the way we traditionally make these vaccines for clinical trials, a dose of the vaccine is worth hundreds of dollars. They cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars each. But when you start manufacturing them at scale in big pharmaceutical factories using a process that we developed for this reason, and there's one other thing about the process I'll mention in a moment, that's where you start to get down to a couple of US dollars a dose. And that's where we are. It is the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine will be a couple of, maybe 2, maybe 4 in that sort of range, US dollars a dose. The other vaccines that have come through so far, the Pfizer, Moderna, are sort of, tens of US dollars a dose. So it is more expensive. The other thing about our manufacturing process, which was really important to us, was it's something that can be manufactured all over the world. So we always wanted to develop a system for the rabies vaccine where we could just send the process to India, or the process to whatever country it is, Australia or Panama, Brazil, wherever they have a manufacturing organization that wants to make the vaccine. We just send it to them and they can make it. And that's what's happening at the moment with the Oxford vaccine. This is why the Oxford vaccine is potentially the vaccine for the world, because we're making it in at least a dozen countries now. And they'll be providing it to each other, and rather than having one central place where we're relying on one big manufacturer to supply everyone. So that's been quite important for us, and that's one of the reasons this works so well. We are continuing to try and get it cheaper. Where my team's working with AstraZeneca to try and get, what we basically do is make the vaccine in huge bioreactors, hundreds and hundreds of liters, or even thousands of liters now. And we're trying to make that process produce even more vaccine by perfecting it and optimizing it more and more, sort of thing. So we may even be able to get it cheaper than that in the long run.
So a common question was, if I get the vaccine today, will I have side effects? Say headache, fever, what other common?
Yeah, very comparable to other vaccines you've had in the past. So if you've ever had a flu vaccine or anything like that, what you'll tend to get, for some people, most people don't, but it, maybe a quarter of people or something like that will have a bit of a sore arm. You might even have a little headache or a little bit of a temperature, low grade temperature, for a day or two, but it all tends to resolve within a couple of days. Very similar to what you get for other vaccines. Again, this is one of the things using this platform. We've put this, not the COVID vaccine, but we've put the same platform, but with a vaccine against malaria or rabies or whatever it is, into thousands of people. And so, we have a good sense of what the side effects are from all that. Tens of thousands of people have gotten our vaccine in clinical trials. As I said, in the UK, now many thousands of people have had the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine through their local GP or hospital. And they're the side effects we're seeing, these low-level side effects. We've not so far seen anything in terms of, the very bad, severe side effects people worry about. In the clinical trials, there were a couple of times we stopped the trials to check, to make, where there was something that happened to someone, to check that it wasn't caused by the vaccine. And that's generally been the case. There was someone, who had a medical condition that hadn't been detected before, which we noticed. If you do clinical trials with tens of thousands of people, you tend to find out things about them because they get studied a little bit more than they have before. So sometimes you discover someone had, just an example, diabetes or multiple sclerosis or something like that, which they hadn't previously realized.
Speaking on
But yeah,
trials, how like severe reactions? Like in the trials, you find out people with severe reactions or people who like died or something?
No. So certainly no one dying. It's if you had a vaccine that would kill someone, just would never be used, sort of thing, or if there were real concerns about that. So no, nothing of that nature, or that sort of severity at all.
There's so many conspiracy theories and people just worried about that changing your DNA or fertility or something. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, look, so when people ask about long-term effects, there's no reason to expect any long-term effects, but of course we don't have that. Every new medicine that gets used in people the first time, the long-term effects are only discovered after many years, and vaccines tend to not have them. Like, vaccines don't really have long-term effects, where some other drugs have over the years. So yeah, I mean, it's not the sort of thing that alters your DNA. The RNA vaccines, the Pfizer, Moderna ones, they don't alter your DNA. Our one, which is using a virus to take some genetic material into your cells, they don't alter your DNA. These things are very carefully designed. Our Shadox is something called an adenovirus. It's been altered so it's replication deficient. So Edison, if we were to inject it into your arm, it will enter your cells, stimulate your immune system, but that's it. It goes no further. You can't spread it to someone else as if it were a virus or something like that. It's we've designed it so that can't happen. It's hard to address all the conspiracy theories because they're so variable. We're not inserting microchips into people. We're not. It's not. The virus isn't caused by 5G. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there were so many questions people asked. I hope we addressed many of them. I would like to ask you a personal one. How do you foresee the future? Do you see we'll have a new normal? How will that new normal be pictured? How will life be? What's the biggest threat of humanity?
Yeah.
In your
that is a big question, Edison. Pandemics are those of us who work in this area, and as you noted, I once gave you a class about pandemics. We had talked about the history of pandemics, what you might do to prepare for one, all those sorts of things, what might happen during a pandemic. Those of us who work in the field always feel like it's a matter of not if, but when a pandemic is going to happen, sort of thing. Diseases spread. There's a lot of people on the planet, and once a disease takes hold that spreads easily, it's very hard to stop, and that's what we've seen with COVID. I expect there'll be other ones. We've had bird flu, we've had swine flu, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, had the West Africa Ebola outbreak, we've had Zika, but this is the one that's had the biggest impact. I think over time we get better and better at responding to them from a scientific perspective. So, as I said, if there was a variant that came along and the vaccine stopped working, we'd get the next vaccine much quicker. One of my biggest criticisms, perhaps, of governments globally, no government in particular, has been there's never like spare vaccine manufacturing capacity just sitting there waiting for something to go wrong. Like, when the pandemic starts, it's not like there was just the British government didn't have a factory just waiting to make the vaccine against COVID. There was nothing, sort of thing. We had to get companies to give us space, perhaps stop making things they had some stocks of for a little while. I think one thing that will be different is certain governments and maybe even international organizations will have systems in place to respond more quickly. So I expect there probably will be factories that can manufacture vaccines very quickly, sort of there ready to go, certainly to respond much more quickly than we had this time. Because that logistics work behind the scenes actually is a lot of what needed to be done to to get us where we are now. And making that easier next time is going to be a success. Like I said, there may be some little things that are different. It was my daughter's birthday a little while ago. And it just struck me watching her that I don't think we're ever going to blow out candles on a cake again. Like, that's just a little thing, but my child, I like cake. My entire childhood memories are, birthday parties and cakes, and you sing happy birthday and you blow out the candles. But I don't think people are going to want to eat a cake that someone's sort of been blowing / spitting on all of a sudden. Are we going to shake hands differently going forward? We don't shake hands at the moment. We sort of either fist pump or sort of wave instead. Those sort of things might change. And as I said earlier, perhaps people will wear masks a little bit more than they used to. I hope we don't feel locked inside long term. I hope, I think a lot of people have probably had a difficult experience under various levels of lockdown all over the world. I hope we're able to reconnect with each other. I think it's quite important for us as people. We're social. Edison, it was always nice to speak to you and see you face to face and things like that when you were in Oxford. This is how we connect to each other. So I hope that returns. And perhaps the big question is, what's the biggest threat? And I think the biggest threat to us going forward is us, sort of thing. I think, people are generally good. People are generally kind. We generally want to look out for each other, but we struggle when it gets big. We find it really hard to think about big groups of people to empathize with each other on a really large scale. And it makes things, like under lockdown, a lot of people start to get upset with each other for not, I don't have to obey the rules if you don't have to obey the rules. But it plays out in all sorts of things like climate change and things like that. Why should I give something up to make everyone else safer, sort of thing. But I hope we can sort of come together, see less of what we've seen in politics over the last few years globally, and maybe act a little bit more collectively going forward.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about that, this relation between collective action for the pandemic and collective action for climate change. Maybe this kind of like a preparation for the coming future in terms of what could come with climate change.
I hope so. There's potentially a conflict between, it's a political comment, we're leaving science now, but, a real conflict sometimes between individual liberties and the collective good, which, some of us are more willing than others to give things up, where some, especially in the West, parts of Europe, North America, Australia, are very much, I should be allowed to do whatever I like and I don't want to be restricted in any way, sort of thing. And that sort of thinking is problematic, as it were, because it's very hard to do things together, and humanity is at its best when we go together. We're at our best when we work together, because we can, look at this vaccine. I don't, those of us at Oxford and AstraZeneca don't look at the Pfizer vaccine and hope it doesn't work. We don't look at it and hope they fail. We look at it and hope everyone succeeds, because we need as much vaccine as we can get as quickly as possible. And the more we have, the better our chances are if a new variant comes along that's problematic. Maybe 1 or 2 vaccines will keep working and some will stop. If we have lots of vaccines available, that gives us the best chance. But that's acting collectively. The only reason we have a vaccine is because the scientists in China sequenced it and shared it with the world. They didn't have to do that. They could have kept that to themselves and tried to make a vaccine themselves, but they shared it. And we all shared our data. Everyone's sharing everything, which is, really positive. I hope that feeling continues, more of that.
Thank you so much, Adam. I really think that you took some time of your busy agenda. I know you guys don't sleep, and that's the reason why you have effectiveness, and you came across with the vaccine, and
yeah, it's been all right for a little while, but I wouldn't want to do this again very quickly.
Thank you so much, Adam Ritchie, Oxford investigator, lecturer, and good friend of mine as well.
Excellent. It's lovely to see you as always, Edison. And hello to everyone in Panama, and I hope one day to see you all in person.